today's panel, this is an excellent group of people who come from a number of different backgrounds and experiences. Jesse running Kraken, Maggie from AirSwap and Fluidity, and also Tawanda who's running Golix, an exchange out of Zimbabwe and Africa. So today's panel, we're really going to try to provide things of value to everyone in this audience. So we're going to kind of structure it in across 3 different topics. So one will be touching on regulation across different regions and across different types of exchanges. And the second topic that we're going to cover is about tokenized business models for exchanges. You know, what have been the advantages and disadvantages? What have been the different approaches and thoughts from each of the people on this panel? And then the third topic we'll be focusing on is user experience. So what are the different considerations that traders and users of exchanges should have? What have been some of the barriers or challenges to adoption? And how should people be looking at the role of centralized exchanges versus decentralized exchanges? So we'll touch on each of those 3 topics, but before we go into more detail, I thought it'd be helpful just to do kind of a brief intro from each of the panelists. So why doesn't everyone just talk about who you are, what you're doing, and what you think is most interesting in crypto this year? So Jesse, start.
Hi, Jesse Powell, co-founder and CEO of Kraken. We're a digital asset exchange founded in 2011. So we trade 17 different assets. Our HQ is in the United States, but we got offices all over the world, about 800 people in the company. Most interesting thing this year, I don't know. I think the rise of decentralized exchanges is really interesting. I'm keeping an eye on that. I'm hoping to see that develop.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maggie Shu, and I lead business development for AirSwap and Fluidity. AirSwap is a decentralized token trading network for ERC20 tokens. We have over 60 tokens available on the platform today, and it's a joint venture between Consensus and Fluidity. And Fluidity is a full-stack asset tokenization and trading platform, so allowing the tokenization and compliant trading for real-world security assets. Prior to that, I was at Zappos.com, the e-commerce company in Las Vegas, as chief of staff to the CEO there, Tony Hsieh. And I became interested in blockchain through the notion of holacracy, which we practiced there, which was this decentralized governance style with no managers and no bosses. And so from that, became interested in the idea of the decentralized autonomous organization and blockchain.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tawanda Kembo. I'm the CEO of Golix. My background is software engineering, so built my first software program in 1999. I was 13 years old at the time, so I wasted 12 years of my life because I started coding at 13. Got interested in crypto. Well, it was really because I'm from Zimbabwe, and in 2008, 2009, were the worst hyperinflation the world has ever seen. So kind of witnessing the wealth my family built over 4 generations lose all its value in just a few weeks because we couldn't take the money out of the bank fast enough. And that's what got me interested in Bitcoin when I first heard about Bitcoin. So now we are, as part of Golix, we're working on putting in a crypto to fiat exchange in every African country. We're now in a few African countries, and we're focused on putting an exchange in every African country.
Excellent. And just a little bit about myself. I'll be short because I'm just the moderator. But I'm running strategy at a new exchange based out of Hong Kong. Prior to that, I started the largest blockchain community at Stanford. If you remember back to the structure of today's talk, we're going to be going through 3 topics. One is regulation. The second is tokenized business models for exchanges. And the third is user experience. So starting on regulation, we're starting with regulation first because that's probably one of the most applicable, one of the most highest priority topics in crypto right now, has been over the past year. So let's kind of go down. Jesse, you guys do a lot of business in both Europe and in North America. I want to ask you 2 questions. The first question is, how do you see regulation in the EU versus North America? And then talk a little bit about some of the efforts that you guys have done with working with regulators and working with advocacy groups.
Sure. So this has been a long process for us. Obviously, getting started in 2011, things have changed a lot over the last 7 years. In some ways, they haven't changed at all. The United States, as an example, still hasn't really figured out what it wants to do about cryptocurrency. Europe has been much more proactive, and we see some positive regulation coming out there. But just to start, they were in a better position because they have this kind of harmonization between all the EU member states, where you can get a license in one country and passport it to all the other countries. So you don't have to appease 50 different regulators like you do in the United States. So the cost of starting up a financial services company in the U.S. is huge because of this state-by-state regulatory scheme. It's developing. I mean, now we see the SEC and the CFTC getting into it. It seems like the SEC is going to be the regulator for crypto tokens for the spot market. But it's not clear yet, even from them, which tokens they think are securities or not. So that's still totally up in the air. They've said they want to see companies get registered as broker-dealers or exchanges, but it's not obvious whether, if you get this license, then what tokens does that allow you to trade? They haven't explicitly said that. They just kind of say, well, we said Bitcoin and Ether are not securities, so you can trade those without a license, but everything else, maybe you need a license, which is not very helpful. So that's kind of where we are right now. And the conversation we always have with them is like, look, you've heard of decentralized exchanges, right? So if you make it really difficult for us to do business, then that's fine. We can shut down in your country or whatever. But what are you going to do about the decentralized exchanges? And to that, they don't have an answer yet.
And so, with regards to regulators, like better understanding the sphere and getting educated, what do you think? What have you guys been doing in terms of working with advocacy groups, donations? I think you guys had announced over the past few months, donations to Coin Center, a group in the U.S. Like, what have you guys been doing there? What do you think is the value of advocacy?
Yeah, so Coin Center is awesome. We donated $2 million to them in May, and basically just to support their operations. They're a think tank. They develop research, and they publish on what regulators are doing. They respond to dumb things said in the media, misunderstandings about crypto. Basically, they're an impartial kind of defender of the technology. They're trying to speak the truth and educate regulators so that egregious errors are not made. And they've had a lot of success so far. So I think it's really important to support those organizations. They're not all over the world yet, unfortunately, and Coin Center is largely focused on the United States. But they've been a huge help, and anytime we interact with a regulator and they say something that is wrong, we can almost always point to Coin Center's response to that thing. So it's been a huge help.
Excellent, excellent. And just on that note, so we were talking a little bit about kind of regulations as they apply to centralized exchanges. Tawanda, you guys are also working on a centralized exchange. Why don't you talk a little bit about policy in a completely different continent, right, in Africa, and talk a little bit about some of the challenges or developments that you've seen in the countries that you guys operate in or did operate in, and what do you see as kind of on the horizon? What's that landscape look like over in Africa?
So first of all, in most of Africa, it's especially in the countries we're operating in, what we see is we're one of the first cryptocurrency companies there. So it's kind of like Jesse mentioned they started in 2011. So Africa today in 2018 is more like it was in the US, in Europe around 2011. So regulators still haven't wrapped their heads around how it works. I know in many places in the world they don't understand this technology worse. It's much worse in Africa. Like some have heard the word Bitcoin, but they're still just trying to figure out how it works and what it means for them. Cryptocurrencies are also, so some regulators also see them as competing so much with local fiat currencies because African fiat currencies, a lot of them are more volatile than Bitcoin right now, so very bad store of value. And so, like when we start seeing an exchange being set up in a country, there tends to be more demand for cryptocurrencies. A lot of African countries also have like very, very stringent capital controls, so it's very hard to move money across across an African border in many of these countries. So regulators do that usually because of forex shortages. So because in many of these countries, they don't have a lot of forex reserves, the central banks and the banks themselves. And those are the first few use cases for cryptocurrency that we're seeing. And so we're seeing people using cryptocurrencies to kind of get around the capital controls. Like we haven't seen a lot of regulators responding yet, except in Zimbabwe. But it would be interesting to see how it plays out. But it's still all very early stage. The cryptocurrency companies in Africa are all still very new. A lot of them are the first companies in their countries. So like it's kind of too early to say how it's going to play out. But what we're trying to do is to try to learn from how people are doing it in other countries. So things like trying to lobby, educate regulators, try to make sure that they don't get their education from the press. They kind of get it from us. And we're starting to see that these things are important, and like trying to learn from other companies that started in 2011.
Are there any like independent advocacy groups like you see in the U.S. that would, serve as educators to regulators in countries in Africa?
No, not yet. Because it's not because cryptocurrency is still something new in many countries in Africa, and we're really the first few companies doing solving a lot of these problems. And regulation is just one of them. So we also don't spend too much time thinking about advocacy and lobbying. So we haven't seen any companies that are just focused on that yet.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's a little bit of perspective on the centralized side of things. Maggie comes from more of the decentralized world in her work at AirSwap and Fluidity. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you see as applicable from a regulatory perspective to what you guys are doing at Fluidity with asset tokenization or anything in the decentralized side that you think is interesting and valuable to bring up?
Yeah, so first on the AirSwap side, it truly is a peer-to-peer decentralized design. So you're connecting and you're trading wallet to wallet, and you can access AirSwap from anywhere in the world. I think that's extremely exciting. As Jesse was saying, that's something that is really powerful. I do think that there is some regulation that's needed, and so we've heard from some potential traders on the platform that they have to do KYC, they have to be in compliance with local laws and regulations, and so we're actually working with an external partner to add a KYC layer to that. So that would be essentially a verification process and then a non-fungible token that's added to your wallet, and then that wallet is whitelisted and you can trade against those counterparties. And so we're trying to do something that bridges those two things. But I think that on the Fluidity side for the security tokens, it will be a compliant exchange and platform, and we have a partnership with a broker-dealer to make that happen. And really where the excitement is there, we've been talking to companies such as real estate funds and other funds. They're excited about automating the non-sexy back-end processing. So that's essentially the regulatory compliance, things like tax reporting and whatnot. And so they want additional investors in their funds, but one of the biggest burdens is just the paperwork. And so if you can bring that onto the blockchain and you can make that compliant, then there's a lot of excitement there.
Like on the tokenization of asset side, are you seeing like regulatory clarity around like who can custody these assets, or like what are you guys seeing on that side?
It's still being worked on, so it's definitely you have accredited investors in different jurisdictions, and so we're actually in some senses you have to go jurisdiction by jurisdiction. There's still clarity. I think custody, and again, there's a panel yesterday on security tokenization. Still trying to figure it out. You have the actual asset itself, and then you have the token that represents the asset, and those are two different things. So as Josh from Harbor was saying, if you get hacked and you have a security token that's hacked, there actually are ways to bring that back, and you have to have that because the security itself needs to know who's on that cap table.
Excellent. So some thoughts on regulation. Not the most exciting of topics, but it's an unfortunate thing that all of us in the industry have to work through and kind of power through. So the next topic of this panel is to talk a little bit about tokenized business models for exchanges. So anyone who's following this space has seen kind of a wide spectrum of business models for both centralized and decentralized exchanges. Some people are using tokens, some people aren't. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in this section to talk a little bit about kind of the use of tokens in different different panelists' business models and or the non-use of those in business models. So Tawanda, why don't you first talk a little bit about the token that you guys are using in the context of your exchange? Why use it? What's the role? What's it doing?
So we tried to solve a couple of problems. So one fundraising, of course, like a second utility. So we do have a business model which is charging fees. So fees to list a token, fees for trading, etc. And you can use it. You can use our token to kind of subsidize that. But the thinking was also kind of more long term. So one problem we've seen running an exchange in Africa since 2015 is liquidity. So liquidity is not really an easy problem to solve on the African continent, specifically because, like, generally all over Africa, we don't have the kind of people we see bringing liquidity on exchanges in places like Europe and the US. So we don't have day traders, we don't have market makers generally in Africa. So we've kind of had to be creative around how we add and source liquidity. We also can't get it from abroad because it's very hard to move fiat currencies outside an African border. So once you, to give an example, if we're to get 1,000 Bitcoin and sell it in a local African country, that money is stuck in a bank account in that country. So it's not easy to move out. So doing our own token, there was also some long-term thinking to it. So one is we think liquidity all over Africa is going to come from the cryptocurrency liquidity is going to come from local companies and projects that are doing token sales and tokenizing their own business models. And so because we one thing we're trying to do is, like, besides being the first exchange to list a token that is a good use case in Africa, we also want to help them through the token sale process. And so doing a token sale ourselves to kind of understand it and, like, setting an example. So that was also the thinking behind doing a token sale ourselves.
Gotcha. And then just skipping around here, we're just trying to stay within centralized versus decentralized space. So skipping around here to Jesse with Kraken, you guys started off in the industry very early player, and as you look to today, you get a highly compliant company, but yet you don't offer a token in your business model, to pay for trading fees or whatever. What's your perspective on that? What's your perspective on the use of a token in a exchange's business model? Have you guys considered it?
Yeah, I think it would have been great to do this back in 2011 because it was so hard, and even today it's still hard to raise capital from traditional VCs who still somehow don't understand the space. It took us a long time to get to Kraken Series A, and it eventually came together through investors that were just like crypto enthusiasts, and not like Silicon Valley VCs. So doing a token sale back then sure would have made things a lot easier. But we've been fortunate to be profitable for a few years now, and we don't need the money. And we're pretty conservative in terms of regulation, and I think that in order to really sell a lot of tokens to raise capital that way, I think you kind of have to promise people that there's some upside there, right? Like, otherwise, why are you buying the token? You can pre-sell like fee credits or something like that, but why would you do that when you just buy Bitcoin instead? So there's got to be a reason for people to buy your token, and they probably need to believe that they're going to increase in value over time to really be interesting, and that's a security. And so that's just it makes it very complicated to do it. And so for us, to raise more capital at this time is not really necessary, and so, like, why take the risk?
So you look at it from the fundraising advantage, not from the operational side. Do you think there's an advantage of using tokens?
Maybe, like frequent flyer miles or something like that. That it's fun to do that, but it doesn't need to be a token like on a blockchain to do it. You can just give people credits on their account or something. Yeah.
Gotcha. And then on the decentralized side, you talk a little bit about how the AirSwap token is used in your ecosystem, how it's used within Fluidity. Talk a little bit about the role in that ecosystem.
Sure. So better. So on the AirSwap side, the AirSwap token, AST, is essentially more like a software license. So AirSwap, there are no fees to use it. There are no fees on the maker's side. There are no fees on the taker's side. It's essentially, there we go. It's essentially staked. And so once you have the token, you can post an intent to trade, and once the trade executes, you get the token back. So, you know, there's a true utility there, and we think that it's pretty important. I will say that more broadly, when you think about decentralized versus centralized trade, I think that centralized exchanges are kind of a necessary evil at this point, and you know, it's something we were talking about earlier, but they do serve some very specific functions, like having the fiat on-ramps and off-ramps, KYC, and at this point, they're where the liquidity is. But really, if those can be solved, and I think that a lot of the decentralized exchanges are looking into solving them, decentralized trade is where it's going. I mean, that's kind of the whole premise behind blockchain, and these centralized exchanges are even more centralized than any other type of exchange. I mean, they act as your bank, they act as your broker, they're executing the trades, they're holding your funds, and they act as a clearinghouse. And so, for me, that's something that just doesn't resonate when it comes to blockchain and the principles behind that. And so I think that it's kind of where, hopefully, where we're going.
Gotcha. So that was kind of the, the second topic of today, to talk a little bit about tokenized business models for exchange. You know, what are the pros, what are the cons? How is it thought about from the perspective of centralized exchanges versus decentralized exchanges? The utility is different, fundraising advantages. So that's kind of like the core of the second topic. The third topic that we're going to end on is user experience. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of the considerations that traders and other investors should be making. Talk a little bit about UX, and kind of talk about how users should be perceiving like the different advantages of using a centralized exchange versus a decentralized exchange. So Jesse, why don't you lead us off and talk a little bit about from your experience in being in the industry for so long. For new money that wants to come in, or even for existing traders, what do you think are kind of the core criteria that people should think through as they're thinking about where to deposit their money and where to trade their money?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of different client personas that we've identified, and it really depends on who the client is to find out what they want. And you know, institutional traders might need somebody that has a particular license to be able to trade on that platform. Individuals, I think that they primarily should be worried about security, right? Because it doesn't matter how much money you make. If it's still on the exchange and the exchange gets hacked, then you might have lost everything, as we've seen many times. So I would put security first. Beyond that, you know, it's kind of up to the user preference. They might care about customer service. They might care about token selection. I'd say those are probably the top two things here from people. You know, I think there's been some. Hello. There's been like a lot of press around. A lot of press about things that I think are not really actually demanded by people, like market surveillance or some kind of like regulations around like manipulation. And I think that it's not, we don't see the people really demanding these things. I think this is like a media thing that they've kind of latched onto. And I don't think that the risks actually exist in the way that they do with kind of traditional markets, because the crypto markets are so transparent and they're so distributed that I think it's a really hard thing to actually do, to manipulate a market. And even if you could identify some sort of manipulation pattern, because there's so many, you know, hundreds of exchanges out there, and you have arbitrage bots that are kind of replicating things across all the exchanges, you could actually have like kind of the seed of some bad behavior maybe on one exchange, you know, on the other side of the world, and then the bots are just going to like replicate it everywhere. So it might be hard to find out like what actually the source was. So I think it's kind of a lost cause going for that, and I don't see that people really care about it because they have so much information. You know, in traditional markets, the data is something that you have to buy. In crypto, it's just given away freely at this point. So, yeah, anyway, security, customer service, token selection.
And then just like piggybacking on that a little bit, so kind of the market health was kind of a little bit of that subtopic there. Do you think, like, if you look online, like recently over the past few months, there's been articles written about people doing research about the true market depth of different exchanges. Do you think there's anything that like any standards that people can rely on to try to figure out whether or not like what's real market depth versus what's manufactured market depth, or you think that space is still evolving?
Yeah, so there's been some research on this, and without actually going to all the exchanges and testing them yourself. There's a site called Bitcoinity that tracks the Bitcoin market depth. Although, we're kind of trusting the exchanges that what they say is there is actually there, and you never really know until you test it. And we hear from some of the traders that trade on our platform, because the largest traders are trading everywhere, and they can tell you kind of which exchanges they're seeing. Like, when I try to make an order for 10 Bitcoin on this exchange, half the time it's not there. That tells you something about what their liquidity actually is. And it's unfortunate that the exchanges are ranked often by volumes, because it gives incentives to artificially inflate an exchange's volume, to appear higher in the rankings. And more volume doesn't mean more liquidity.
So on that side, kind of just going over to Decentraland for a little bit, decentralized exchange world. What's your perspective on like existing liquidity for decentralized exchanges and kind of the performance trade-offs? What have you guys seen?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, decentralized exchanges are a fraction of the volume that you're seeing in centralized exchanges, and I think one thing is that in a centralized exchange, the liquidity is kind of stuck there, and so if you're trading a token, you have to pull it out and then put it onto another centralized exchanges, where decentralized exchanges theoretically have this global pool of liquidity that can be accessed. It's just that back to your question about the user interface, it might not be a good user experience, and so people are still trying to figure out how to make that better. So one of the things we think about is the retail versus the institutional trader, and what sorts of information do they want to see. And on the retail trading side, they probably don't need all that information, and they want to see something that's simpler and maybe more gamified, where they're looking at the utility of the token. They might be looking at different ways to use it, and they don't need to have the same data that an institutional trader would use. So we think a lot about how do you show these different types of people what they want to see and make it as intuitive as possible. We're actually working on an update to the platform for OTC traders that will be much more conversational, and that'll allow them to have those conversations with each other and actually execute trades in a much more conversational way, and that's kind of a third element that we've been looking at.
What else do you think is needed in the decentralized exchange space to enable better levels of user experience, or to create more liquidity? What do you think needs to be developed over time?
I mean, I think it comes back to the fiat on-ramps, right? So we want to be in this crypto world, but at the end of the day, there's still real fiat bills and things that we have to pay for. And so if they can figure that out, that would, I think, be a game changer. But for now, I think a lot of exchanges are still working on it.
And then Jesse, you mentioned at the start of this panel that one of the things you're most excited about in crypto, like this year and going forward, is are decentralized exchanges. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What's your perspective on that trend going forward?
Yeah, I think if we can get it right, if we get to the point where decentralized exchanges are so great that there aren't really any advantages of centralized exchanges, then we've all won, right? Like it'll be fantastic. We won't have to worry about counterparty risk of your exchange. Potentially, you don't have to worry about any regulation or your local government preventing you from trading the assets you want to trade. Your currency controls in your country preventing you from trading. So I think that's like the goal for everybody. Everybody who's like really into crypto because they love the potential of crypto to change the world. I think they see decentralized exchanges as the future and the goal. But like Maggie said, I think we're a ways off from being there at this point, and the centralized exchanges are kind of a bridge to get there.
What do you think the differing roles that each of those types of exchanges will play over time for users? Like what will users go to centralized exchanges for, and what will users go to decentralized exchanges for? Over the next few years as the industry plays out. What do you think?
Well, for sure, decentralized exchanges can offer a few advantages. One, if you want to trade totally anonymously, there will be some decentralized exchanges that allow you to do that. If you want to trade completely crazy, like toxic shit coins that no centralized exchange could possibly touch, you could do that on a decentralized exchange. And then if you want to trade like directly from your wallet without having to trust the exchange, you can do that. And these things are already like there today. They're just like very early stages, and like Maggie said, you know, it's largely like a user experience issue at this point to figure out how to make it easy enough for people to use the decentralized exchanges over the centralized exchanges.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're out of time, but I hope that 30 minutes was interesting and valuable to everyone here. We summarized through, you know, kind of the regulatory atmosphere right now, talked a little bit about tokenized business models in the context of exchanges, and then kind of ended by talking about user experience, centralized versus decentralized. So hopefully that was helpful. Enjoy the rest of your time here. Thanks.
Thanks.